Well, Justin Worland is the senior correspondent at Time Magazine, covering climate change and the intersection of policy, politics, and society. His new Time cover story, The Diplomat, John Kerry Brings America Back to the Climate Fight, is out now. This is fascinating read. And Justin, welcome back to the Climate Pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
So much has happened. Last time you were on, it was COVID was shutting things down. We were talking at the time whether or not this COP26 thing was going to happen at the end of 2020. Definitely didn't. So here we are back in late 2021 talking about it again. But you just released this incredible profile of Special Envoy John Kerry, the US Special Envoy for Climate Change, who's going to be at COP26. Is going to play this critical role at the conference itself. And, it's kind of interesting because, he's 77 years old. He didn't have to take this role. This honestly may be the signature event of his time in the role as a special envoy. It might be the last major political role of his enormously influential career. You talked to Secretary Kerry quite a bit. What did you learn from talking to him last summer about what COP26 might mean to him?
Yeah, well, I spent really for much of the year having sort of regular conversations with him beginning in March. And then, as you mentioned, over the summer, did a trip to Naples and the G20. And then again in September, did sort of two trips really with him. And so I got, I think, a good sense of how he's thinking and feeling about things. And some of it is rather obvious, right? He's really committed to this idea of 1.5 and keeping the world, keeping 1.5 alive. I think it's interesting, to hear him, I write in the article about how he's an internationalist, how he can speak to these sort of international audiences. And he really does have a handle on articulating the needs of other countries, and also speaking very clearly about some of the challenges in the US domestic context, and frankly, the challenges, dealing with sort of communicating that to other countries. And so I was struck, some of the big things we've seen over this year, questions about, will Congress pass climate legislation? Can the US deliver on its commitment to help the developing world with regard to climate mitigation and adaptation? And Kerry would articulate those challenges perfectly well. He would say, look, we have to deliver this or else we're not credible. I don't know. It's an open-ended question. I could keep going for really quite a bit, but I think really did get a sense that he is pushing for the things that he, would say sort of rhetorically he would speak about.
Yeah, we've obviously seen over the last several years this breakout of nationalism. And you talk about in your piece, Kerry is so committed to multilateralism. We were actually we did a series on the 1970s energy crisis earlier in this year. And what you realize is those senators that came up in the 70s, in the 80s, like Joe Biden, like John Kerry, they are still around people that were there for the New Deal, that were there for all the multilateralism that happened after World War II, not to mention that they're sort of forging their careers, especially Secretary Kerry, on those kind of bona fides. And I think that's just kind of fascinating to think about him going into COP26 and certainly and Paris as well 5 years ago, when there is so much nationalism. That's something that is going to be around COP26. That's certainly going to be an obstacle that's going to be around COP26 and could even inhibit the talks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the story. It's a profile of Kerry, absolutely. But it's also a look at this person who is a figure, as you said, who grew up in the post-war era, has a view of international engagement and multilateralism, and is, fighting for the climate, but also fighting for a theory of change, which is, that countries are going to work together to solve this. And really, I sort of make the argument that Glasgow is a test of that, and perhaps like a tipping point moment. If multilateralism doesn't work now, what comes next might be something like, sticks with CBAM and with other sorts of punitive measures that countries might use to sort of deal with the climate issue in a way that they haven't thus far. And Kerry is like, fighting to keep that multilateral system alive. And I think, Fox News has criticized me for, quote unquote, glorifying him in this profile, but I think the story shows that he's strained in doing it, right? Like he's not, just having immense success. There's a lot of challenges to try to keep that approach alive. And I think, we'll see what happens in Glasgow.
Well, yeah, there's a ton of domestic pressure. You did a great piece recently on the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill. And it's so funny, talking to world leaders and they're all thinking like, what's the matter with West Virginia? And, like all eyes are on West Virginia. What have you, speaking to people outside of the United States, what have they made of this reconciliation package that might sort of make or break the president's agenda when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to see the sort of understanding that other leaders in other countries have of what's happening in U.S. domestic politics. And just to speak to someone in Paris or in Warsaw and hear them say, well, what is Joe Manchin thinking? And I'm like, your guess is as good as mine. But I think the truth is that people are really watching U.S. domestic politics very closely right now. Again, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, because it's a question of like, does this multilateral system, particularly with regard to climate, where each country brings its own commitments and does its own domestic thing, is that working? Is that going to work? And I think there's still a lot of questions, and I think, but people are watching it closely. Really, really, pretty much everyone I talk to is watching the U.S. domestic situation closely.
And so overall, there's that UN report earlier this year that said with the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that we have now, we're going to hit 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. That's astronomically high. That goes way past what we wanted in Paris. And we had Dr. Ed Hawkins on earlier this year when the IPCC report came out. And, in that report, they're a little bit cagey about whether 1.5 is even possible. And then you talked to Secretary Kerry about that. Keeping warming at 1.5 is still a stated goal. It's still something that world leaders are attempting to do. I think you cite the World Resources Institute that mentions some possibilities of keeping warming at 1.5. I mean, this feels like Glasgow is going to be the one of the critical events to sort of determine whether 1.5 is even possible. How do you think the stakes of that will influence the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I did the sort of first interview in this Kerry story in Naples, and I was sort of not just with Kerry, but just around G20 climate ministers from around the world, the 20 largest economies roughly, I think there is a sense that you get from people that there is a understanding and a fear, frankly, of the stakes, right? I think people, you can almost feel it, you can sense it in conversations. How does that translate? I think is a big open question, right? Like we're at a point now where not everybody, but most people get it. And will that actually override, sort of some of the typical domestic concerns? I don't know. And I think, what we've seen, in the last year is not frankly encouraging.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at stimulus spending, right? I mean, there's a report from the IEA of the 16 trillion in support measures. It was something like 3% has gone to clean energy and other clean technology spending. I mean, that's abysmal. So I think people get it. I think 1.5 is on everyone's mind. I don't know that it's going to actually lead to anything. And to your point, I mean, Glasgow really is kind of like it's the last stop on sort of a year of last best chances, right? That $16 trillion could have changed things. The presidential election, the US did change things. We'll see what happens with the reconciliation package. But Glasgow is kind of the last thing in this series of things that is going to be very decisive.
Yeah, what do you think it's going to be like for Secretary Kerry to be representing the United States going to Glasgow after 4 years of President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? I mean, I think this year he had the momentum of coming in after the election, and I think everybody around the world was excited that Biden, has replaced Trump, right? And I think it's telling that despite all of these other concerns, for the most part, he was welcomed with open arms, right? There was encouragement. I mean, there were some challenges in China, of course, but but for the most part, people want to talk to him and talk to the U.S. I think that now is the point though where push comes to shove, and it is a very challenging thing to communicate that you want. Kerry's out there saying China, you need to do more. X country, Russia, you need to do more. But everybody can just turn back around and say, well, what are you doing? And I think that the sort of goodwill that he had over the course of the year is going to be tested, and I think he would easily admit that as well.
And he gives you great insight into how he thinks about the relationship with China in the profile piece. Obviously, US-China relations. This is going to be a critical point, not only in Glasgow, but obviously, as you mentioned, it's been a huge focus in this entire year, and it's going to be a huge focus even after Glasgow. But I'm curious, when it comes to the United States relationship with other countries, other critical countries in this fight, who are you going to be watching, when it comes to how Kerry is interacting with other countries at Glasgow?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a few. I mean, if you look at the G20, I think the question is, what can the U.S. do to push countries like India, like Saudi Arabia, Indonesia? I think these are countries that the U.S. has focused a lot of attention on, and with sort of mixed results. I think clearly, like you look at the Saudi announcement last weekend. The net zero announcement. I think the U.S. pushed Saudi hard. Are they happy with the result? I don't know, but I guess I would say a lot of those G20 countries. I also think it's interesting to talk to allies of the U.S. I mean, talk to the people in the EU, right? So I talked to Frans Timmermans, who runs the climate policy in the EU, and again, very welcoming of Kerry, and talks about his great relationship. And I quoted in the piece, I did a separate story where he said, "Yeah, it's great. Now show me your plan." and so I'm curious to see what are the communications like with allies who you want to be on the same page with, and who clearly they are on the same page with conceptually and sort of on a more relational level. But when it comes to the actual substance, how do they respond? How do they engage? So that's, I think, another interesting thing to see.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, like the success failure framing of a given conference can certainly be complicated, but I think most people who are committed to some sense of climate action all agreed that COP25 was a huge failure, and because a lot of the logistical aspects that they wanted to get done just didn't get done. So it can come, and I'm kind of curious. We obviously talked about trying to stay at 1.5, but when it comes to some of the actual accomplishments that could get done at a COP, well, carbon markets, funding for loss and damages, helping other countries accelerate their clean energy transition. Do you have a sense of what world leaders would like to see hammered out before the end of the negotiations?
Well, obviously, you mentioned carbon markets, Article 6. This is, this has been a long-standing area that needs to be resolved, and I think there's hope and some realistic optimism that maybe that will actually be resolved here. And of course, for anybody who isn't in the weeds of this, this would allow for global carbon markets, which it facilitates carbon pricing across the globe, and that would be a significant thing. I think there's going to be an interesting question and tension about climate finance for the developing world, and not only the number, but also how much of that is flowing towards adaptation. And so it's funny because you'll sometimes see some Americans officials speak on this, and it'll almost be like, oh yeah, and we want to help with adaptation, but it really is for a lot of, you said world leaders, like if you're talking, it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone from much of the global south, that might be priority number one that they'd like to see. And I think that's something that there might be some discussion on, or some sort of resolution, or I don't know about resolution, but some sort of progress on.
Sure.
Loss and damage is another priority, as you said, for many leaders in the global south. It's a little unclear to me, how exactly how that could be resolved. I don't know what the landing zone is there. Admittedly, though, I'm probably a few weeks behind on loss and damage and what the discussions are there. But yeah, all important topics.
We're 2 full years since COP25. How do you think that delay might impact negotiations?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing with this delay is that we had this weird year of everything stopping. I mean, just like most of our lives stopped in some way or another. The sort of normal pace of discussions and travel stopped, and then kind of picked up, sort of. And so we have, I think, for a lot of people, coming here, this will be their first time really engaging in an in-person way in 2 years. And I think that is an interesting challenge, where a lot of the sort of groundwork that might have typically been done, the sort of behind the scenes negotiations, discussions, understandings that would have been reached in the year between the COP, even though there's been 2 years, it just hasn't happened. And so I think that is a real way that the delay has affected conversations.
Well, I'm going to be curious to watch, again, with domestic pressures. There's obviously been a great deal of stimulus around the world. As you mentioned, so much of that has gone to fossil fuels and not clean energy. And I'll just be curious to see if that creates pressures on countries in the year to come to make commitments when it comes to something like loss and damage, funding for adaptation, right? In the industrialized nations, including the United States, there can be some doubt as to whether that will put pressure on leaders to do more domestically and have less funds for sort of international needs. I mean, real needs.
Right. I mean, I don't know what the right thing to say to that, but I mean, yes, I think it does raise some interesting questions about funding for needs. I mean, this is going to be a challenge going forward, right? We think about, people talk about how much addressing climate change costs, but there's a lot of, in terms of, thinking about, say, the Build Back Better agenda, right? But there's also a lot of costs that with regard to adaptation and other things that are going to line up. And how do you prioritize that is a big question going forward. I'm not sure I quite answered your question, but
I'm not sure I even had a question in there. This is something I think I'm going to be monitoring closely. One of the major talking points, or one of the major topics coming into the conference, is whether COP26 should have been held in person at all. When you think about one of the great things about COP, if there are great things about COP, is that every nation can have a voice at COP, right? That can separate it from some of the other international climate events that happen throughout the year. But obviously, we have real inequality when it comes to vaccine distribution that can affect the conference itself. How do you think that conversation, or whether COP should have happened or not, do you think that's going to be something that hangs over the conference over the next couple of weeks?
Well, I definitely think that the inequitable access to vaccines and access to getting there is something that's going to hang over the conference for sure. And I think that really, regardless of what the outcome is, that's something that that countries from the global south are going to tout. I mean to mention, as sort of a caveat, as an asterisk to the talks. Clearly. This has been a huge issue for the UK government, where they've tried to figure out how can we, literally distribute vaccines through their network of embassies. How can they, change quarantine rules, et cetera, et cetera. And it's still, not enough. And I don't think it's a legitimate critique to say it's not enough, right? There's inequitable access. And to your point, it's a shame because COP, historically has been this place that is unlike most other sort of global gatherings where, of course, the US and European countries have, more resources and more people, but it's a place where still everybody is to some degree on equal footing and can access or can have the floor in the same way. And every country has, a veto over the sort of final COP decisions. So it's really a unique place. It's not, the UN Security Council. It's like a place where everybody's got a say. And, it won't be the same this year. Though I do think that, as I was alluding to earlier, some of the worst fears have been addressed. I think in large part because of the very vocal calls to either, push back COP or to, hold it virtually. I would just also say it's like, I get this question all the time from people who are, sort of in climate, but or maybe not in climate. People follow climate loosely, but not deeply. Well, why can't we just do this virtually? And I do think, my personal observation would be, it is very hard to connect with people, around the world in completely different time zones where internet may or may not be reliable. And to say that it's like a real connection, they would have, an equal say. And so I think it's hard because there's no good answer to it, but there clearly is good reason to hold it in person, even if it's not, the ideal situation.
No, absolutely. And I kind of imagine as a reporter, as someone covering this, COVID still, has produces so many challenges for you as well. What is it going to be like covering COP26 with this pandemic still going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have gotten on the road a bit, and everything is different now. But it's also, it's like, it is a huge relief to be back seeing people in person, engaging in person. I think, I am, frankly, I get a little bit of confidence. There's like a nice sense of security knowing that, if you're attending, you've taken your COVID test that day. And so that's reassuring. But I don't know. I think the sort of the truth is, I don't know. We're going to see what it's like there. I'm still mystified, getting a million invites to a million different events I'm like, how are you hosting this? And how are we all going to gather? And I guess I'll have to report back because I'm a little mystified by it.
Yeah, this great line in your most recent piece, a quote, "This year, the fate of our civilization is being determined in bland convention center meeting spaces, slick corporate boardrooms, and regal hotel ballrooms," unquote. It's like, overall, what is COP like?
Yeah, COP is this bizarre thing, right? Because there's the official proceedings, and then there are all the side events, and there's, the activists who are protesting, and we're talking about tens of thousands of people all doing sort of different things in the same place. That I alluded to it, right? Like there's the bland ballroom, or there's the bland conference rooms, which is, where a lot of sometimes, these official negotiations take place. I'm not yet in Scotland, so I don't know what they look like this time around. But and then there's like, the sort of behind the scenes hotel conference rooms where maybe there's sort of side events or, discussions happening that will inform the official talks or not. They could just be going on the side. And then there's always like, protesters coming through, which is always this funny thing because on the one hand, most, if not, many, if not most of the people who are actually negotiating agree with the protesters to some degree, but they're sort of there to push for momentum. And then, there'll be like a high profile person who comes through and maybe you get like a security detail that pushes you aside. It's very odd. And there's, I should say, not much sleep often. I don't know. It's a bizarre thing. Hard to describe.
Well, I absolutely wish you luck over the next couple of weeks. I mean, honestly, you are so good at so much what you do in your climate
Thank
coverage,
you.
but particularly the way you cover international policy and politics is exceptional. So for people listening to this, they've got to follow your work over the next couple of weeks, because I'm really excited to see what you report on. How can you follow your work online?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to say that. I would just say I think there is need to focus and understand the international element. I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation. I mean, there's so much important happening on the domestic side here in the US, but and so I do focus on that, and I really appreciate that comment. You can follow me on Twitter at Justin Worland, or just you could type my name in Google and go to the Time page, and you'll see my stuff there. So, in Time is also doing a daily newsletter. Me and a few colleagues, which you can sign up to at time.com/climate-newsletter. You could also just Google Time Climate Newsletter and find it that way.
I'm definitely going to be checking that out, as should all of our listeners. Again, the most recent piece is The Diplomat. John Kerry brings America back to the climate fight. Justin Worland, always great to talk to you. Thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Hey, thanks again for having me. It's great to talk.